Hi, I'm Rick Dior, and right there I was just playing a few different examples of what I've played recently in back or support of some bass solos, including electric bass and upright bass in different kinds of gigs. I know it sounded weird, but in the context when a bass player is playing a lot of notes or not many notes, I just try to be supportive. So this video is entitled Your Friend the Bass Player, and you better believe it, that's your best friend on the gig, because the bass player is the most important thing, at least if you're playing with a bass player, on a gig. Because if you don't have a good relationship musically, it doesn't have to be personally, but musically with that player, the gig's going to be bad. It's going to suck. All right? It's important that you two get along musically. So I've played with hundreds and hundreds of bass players over my 50-year career, and pretty much, I'd say 98% of them I've gotten along with musically and personally. It's been a few little strange occurrences, but mostly I get along great with bass players because I kind of feel like I know what they want to hear usually, and I get out of the way. And if I'm playing with a bass player who's really busy, in other words, plays a lot of notes, a lot of fills, I go the other way. I play really simple. So it's kind of like a counter measure there. Like I always picture like a scale, and one side is busy, one side is not busy. And the whole idea is to get it to balance so it's not all busy and it's not all not busy. Because, you know, busy can equal excitement. And for the soloist who's in front of the band, even if it's a singer or a guitar player or a sax player or trumpet player, they like it sometimes for the rhythm section to kick them in the butt. So yeah, it's a fine line. Now, these days, or the past, I'd say maybe 20 years, I've played mostly with bass players who I know. Every once in a while, I'll play with someone who I've never played with before. Personality-wise, try to get along. Always, always, always. If you get to a gig and there's sort of a thing going on, just chill out, do your best, and go home and make it a point to never get on a gig with that person again. And you can ask. I ask the band leader, these days for sure, although it's not usually a problem. I'll say who's on the gig when I'm deciding to take the gig. And it's just, if it's someone I don't know, I kind of try to check them out, because the worst thing for me now would be to get on a gig with a bad player and have to suffer through that. It's when like 3 hours becomes 20 hours, and then it lasts in your head after. So I try to avoid that at all costs. But if you're a young, up and coming musician, you don't have those options. You take every possible gig, like I did, that I could. I worked every night when I lived in New York. I had to pay my rent in the late 70s, 80s, into the early 90s. And I played with so many bass players, you know, dozens and dozens of great world-class players too, and some not so great. So you just do your best. Now, one thing that we're going to talk about in this video today is how to assess where you're at as a drummer when you get on the gig. So I consider myself to have really good time. I play with a metronome all the time in the studio. You've seen me do tons of videos. So I'm aware of the time, but time isn't the same as feel. They're two different things. You could have perfect time and a crappy feel. So one thing that I've always tried to do is make myself elastic, like a rubber band. So if I'm on a gig with a bass player and they have a different kind of feel, in other words, they're playing kind of on top of the beat or behind the beat or right on the beat, and that's definitely a thing, I adjust to that because I can do all those things. And if I feel like they're playing way behind the beat, I'll play a little on top of the beat so things don't slow down. Again, I'm very lucky. I play with some great electric and upright players all the time. And their time is right on. And they're kind of the same as me, you know, they listen. So that's the magic word right there, listening. If you get with a bass player who doesn't listen and is just in their own little world, good luck. All right. So there's several things I consider to be what makes a great bass player, and then there's a few other intangibles that aren't as important. The most important thing to me in a bass player is time. In other words, the space between each beat they play, that it's even, quantized. Okay. So that's a natural thing. You can't really teach that. There's people that can practice all day with a metronome and study and do all this, and they still have crappy time. That's just the way it goes. So if you get on a gig with someone who has bad time, in other words, they're fluctuating within the time, within the beat. So if you're playing a simple groove like this, you know, and that bass player is matching up. It's a tune that's written out. We're reading an arrangement. I get a lot of those lead sheets. And those particular 16th notes, which is common, aren't together, or they're not consistent. That's very common in inexperienced players. That's a drag, because then the groove is gone, okay? A lot of times, the other musicians will not have as good a time feel as the rhythm section, as the drummers, because drumming is so physical. Usually drummers, you know, usually they have pretty strong time if they've got a lot of experience. Like, so if you get a piano player who plays a lot of notes, they rush and all. The bass player and the drummer can keep those guys penned up. Or a sax player likes to play a lot of notes and they're not playing a lot of good time there. If you have a strong bass player and a drummer, that really, really is a big thing. That makes everything feel good, even though maybe the other guys, if they're not playing with good time, you can save the day. All right, so that's the first thing. I call that quantization. You're quantized. You're even, all right? The next thing I really look for is sound. So sound is really important. In other words, the sound of the amp, if it's amplified, the sound of the bass, if it's acoustic, the way they play that instrument. Are they playing every note short? Like, I've played with bass players that when they walk time, they're playing like doop, 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 doop. Sounds like an Ampeg baby bass. It's like a mute on there. I hate that because there's no length to the notes. The notes when you're walking should be basically long, 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 all right? And then when you play the next note, that note stops. But when you're muting the notes, that's a terrible feel if you're a drummer, if you want it to sound smooth. So if you're going... which is just cruising along on the highway, you know? And if you got a bass player who's going, doot, 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 it's terrible. It's like playing your bass drum like this. So that's not good. And if that happens, there's nothing you can do. Just, you can play your bass drum very, very light. And that's one thing you should always do when you're playing anything modern, jazz-wise. Feather that bass drum. If I was a bass player and I was doing the opposite video, your friend, the drummer, the first thing I would say is, don't play your bass drum too loud if you're playing jazz. Don't do this. Because bass players hate that, all right? The other thing, while we're on the topic that a lot of them hate, is if you tune your bass drum really high for jazz, and they usually won't tell you this, but if you have I have several close friends who are bass players, and they play with drummers, their bass drum is tuned really high and it rings. That interferes with the intonation of a bass player. I don't know if you realize that, but that's a problem, and it rings and it's crazy. So a lot of times for gigs, for jazz gigs, I won't tune my bass drum too high. I'll tune it a little bit lower, and I'll make sure it doesn't ring too much, so it doesn't interfere with their fundamental tones when they're walking. That's very annoying for them. So it's just something that I've spoken to lots of bass players. That's their sort of problems they have with drummers. That one, the bass drum's too loud. Two, it's tuned to a pitch that is interfering with everything. And that's common, and that's sort of the bebop thing that drummers like to do, tune their bass drum really high. But a lot of bass players, not all of them, but a lot of them hate that. So that's something to consider with your bass drum. So I go for a lower tuning so I don't get in their way. All right? And while we're on this topic, we're going to move around a little today like I usually do. I jump, right? The other thing that you got to watch out for when you're playing with a bass player is how you accompany their solos. And that's what we started this video with. So when it's the bass player's turn to play a solo, if it's an upright player, you've got to remember, even though they're amplified maybe, that's an acoustic instrument. If you play an electric bass without an amp, there's no sound at all. Most of them, except if they're built acoustically, okay? But the acoustic bass is built to use without an amp. It's an orchestral instrument. All the great jazz players, instruments they're playing on were not made for jazz. They were made for playing in orchestras 200 years ago, okay? Under the bass solos, what you want to do is keep it super clean if you're just playing a traditional jazz gig, something dry, like just a hi-hat. One of my favorite things is a flat ride under bass solos with rivets, very quietly. I don't have a flat ride here today, but something like this. And whatever interaction you want to do with them, but be really, really conscious that you're not stepping on what they're playing. So again, go easy, try to help them, be like a safety net. And if they start playing some crazy hemiola or out of time, you need to be a net to catch them. So that's something you want to consider when you're playing under the bass solo. So the last thing that's really important to me, besides sound, having a good amp sound, having a good bass sound, is intonation. So that's a huge topic, and most bass players, especially upright players, are super paranoid about intonation because remember, it's a fretless instrument. So that's the hardest thing to do on an upright bass or any string instrument is to play in tune. And of course, the drummer can't affect that other than making sure that your bass drum is not weird pitches. Don't play a lot of toms under bass solos. You know, just be wary of your tuning, be aware of things like that. If things are clashing, you need to have a good ear. I play a lot of timpani, I play a lot of piano. I have a really good sense of pitch, so that helps. But some bass players, no matter what, they're just going to always play out of tune, especially when they're playing arco, which is, you know, the old Paul Chambers solos. That tends to get out of tune. All right, but that's one thing that you can't really help them with, but you can kind of stay out of the way. If they take out that bow during a solo, play less and play high sounds, not low sounds. When a bass player takes out the bow during a solo, it doesn't happen often anymore, immediately the highest sounds I can think of are going to be best for that. All right? That's just the way I think about it. So that's the other important thing for a bass player. So you got time, you got sound quality, and you got intonation. Then the last thing, obviously, is you can't control attitude, the way they approach the gig. You know, are they happy to be there? Are they fun to be around? Do you have good eye contact at points? You don't need to stare at each other and blow kisses, but, you know, sometimes you need to have eye contact and just, you know, enjoying yourselves. Always be kind, be supportive in your playing. And when it comes time for your solo, hopefully they'll do the same. And you know, just try to get along with all of your musician friends. So we'll see you next time.